The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days, turning the roads of northern France into long veins of mud. Trucks crawled through them like wounded insects, their wheels half sunk in brown water, carrying messages, ammunition, and men who looked too tired to remember their names. The war had become a storm that refused to move. In the middle of that storm, in a quiet farmhouse near Caen, a woman sat alone by the flickering light of a single oil lamp. Her name was Elise Laurent. To the villagers, she was a widow who kept to herself. To the German officers, she was harmless, just another civilian who sold milk and bread at the checkpoint each morning. But to London, she was Sparrow, a field operative of the British Special Operations Executive. And tonight, she had one job: to change the course of a battle before the sun rose again. On the table in front of her lay a radio transmitter wrapped in cloth, its dials worn smooth from months of use. The message she had just received was short, almost absurd in its simplicity. Operation Hammer falls at dawn. Confirm Axis armor location immediately. She read it 3 times. Her hands trembled slightly. She knew what it meant. Allied command was about to launch a major offensive to break the German line outside Caen, one that could decide whether the Allies pushed east toward Paris or stalled for months. But intelligence reports had gone silent. Something was wrong. If the German Panzer Division had moved overnight, the entire attack would walk straight into slaughter. The radio hissed softly. Then, faintly, a voice whispered through the static, "Sparrow, respond. Over." She pressed the switch. Copy, message received. "I will confirm by sunrise." Then she turned off the set, blew out the lamp, and stood in darkness. The only sound was the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Each second was a heartbeat. Outside, the rain had slowed to a mist. Elise wrapped herself in a wool cloak and stepped into the cold. The world smelled of mud and gunpowder. In the distance, artillery thumped like a slow drum. She walked down the narrow path toward the village, her boots silent on the wet earth. Every shadow looked alive. Every window might be watching. She had survived 2 years this way, lying, smiling, selling bread with coded notes baked inside. Her eyes saw everything. Her mouth said nothing. At the edge of the village, she reached the checkpoint. 2 German soldiers stood by the gate, smoking. One of them, Lieutenant Kruger, knew her well. He was young, polite, and too proud to suspect kindness. "Frau Laurent," he said, smiling as she approached. "Out late again? The curfew is not optional." "I had to fetch my cow," she said, forcing a weary laugh. She wandered into the orchard again. "Stupid animal." Kruger grinned. "Next time, tell her the Wehrmacht doesn't allow night walks." "I will, Lieutenant. Good night." She walked past him, feeling his eyes linger on her as she disappeared into the dark. Once clear of the village, she quickened her pace. Beyond the fields, the German armored camp sat hidden beneath the forest ridge. She had memorized every path, every guard rotation. If she could confirm the tank's position, she could transmit coordinates before dawn. If she failed, hundreds of men would die in the morning. The forest swallowed her. The air smelled of pine and diesel. Somewhere ahead, engines rumbled faintly, the sound of machines sleeping before the storm. She crept forward until the ground leveled into a clearing. Through the fog, she saw them. Silhouettes of tanks lined under camouflage nets. Dozens of them. But something felt off. They weren't idling. They were cold. She crouched, heart pounding. The Germans had moved. Only decoys remained, her breath caught. That meant the real Panzer Division had pulled back south, directly behind the Allied advance. The trap was already set. She turned to leave, but a twig cracked behind her. A voice spoke softly in German, "Nicht bewegen." "Don't move." She froze. A flashlight beam cut through the fog, landing on her face. The soldier was close, too close to run. He stepped forward, rifle raised. "Who are you?" Elise blinked, pretending to be frightened, her French accent thick and trembling. I got lost. I was looking for my cow. The soldier frowned. At midnight? In the forest? She nodded rapidly. She ran off. I heard noises. He hesitated, uncertain. Then, lowering the gun slightly, he said, This area is restricted. Go home before someone less kind finds you. She exhaled, nodding. Yes, of course. Thank you, soldier. She turned slowly, careful not to show the small pistol hidden under her sleeve. But before she could take 2 steps, another flashlight appeared. And another voice. Was es los? 2 more soldiers emerged from the fog. One of them recognized her. That's the widow from the village, he barked. Why is she here? Panic shot through her chest. She reached for her sleeve. The first soldier shouted, Wait! Too late. She fired once. The shot echoed through the trees. The soldier fell, clutching his chest. The others shouted, raising their rifles. Elise sprinted into the dark as bullets tore through the branches around her. She didn't stop. The forest exploded with noise. Shouting, running, gunfire. Her foot caught on a root, and she fell hard. Pain shot up her leg, but she crawled forward, dragging herself into a ditch. The world spun. Rain hit her face. She pressed her hand to the wound in her side. Warm blood, too much of it. But she still had her notebook, still had the coordinates. She tore the page free, soaked it in mud, and shoved it into her boot. Then she pulled herself upright and limped toward the road. By the time she reached the farmhouse, dawn was bleeding into the horizon. The rain had stopped. Her fingers shook as she tuned the radio. Static. Then the same voice, urgent. Sparrow. Report. Operation Hammer begins in 15 minutes. She pressed the transmitter. Her voice was barely a whisper. Panzers relocated. South Ridge, near the river. Repeat. South Ridge. They've set a trap. Redirect attack. Static swallowed her words. She adjusted the dial again, pressing harder. Confirm you copy. South Ridge, move now. Silence. She tried again. Nothing. The radio was dead. For a moment she sat there, trembling, staring at the silent machine. Then she realized the antenna cable had been hit. A bullet through the wall had severed it. She looked out the window. The sky was turning orange. There was only one option left. She had to reach the field agent in the next village, a courier who could send the message by car to Allied lines. 15 kilometers. No time to think. She grabbed her cloak, pressed her hand against the bleeding wound, and stumbled into the dawn. The road was empty, except for mist. Each step was agony. She kept repeating the message in her head like a prayer. South Ridge. South Ridge. Don't forget. Halfway to the village, she heard engines behind her. A German convoy, trucks, motorcycles, and a half-track. She threw herself into a ditch, gasping as the vehicles roared past. When they were gone, she crawled out, drenched in mud, and kept walking. By the time she reached the edge of the next town, her vision blurred. The church bell rang somewhere far away. She stumbled into the bakery, a safe house, and collapsed behind the counter. A man appeared, startled. Elise! Mon Dieu! She grabbed his arm. Send message to London, South Ridge. Move attack! Go! He hesitated. You're hurt! Go! She screamed, blood flecking her lips. No! He ran. She lay there, listening to his footsteps fade, and smiled faintly. For the first time all night, she let herself breathe. Outside, the morning broke. Hours later, far to the north, British artillery that had been aimed at empty woods pivoted suddenly toward the southern ridge. Infantry units changed course. Tank columns halted. The Germans, waiting in ambush, found themselves staring at an army coming straight from a direction they thought safe. The battle that should have been a massacre turned into a rout. By nightfall, the ridge was in Allied hands. The panzers burned in their own trap. London recorded it as a tactical miracle. A last-minute intelligence coup that saved hundreds of lives. The agent responsible was never identified. In the ruins of Caen, soldiers found a farmhouse burned to the ground. Among the ashes lay a broken radio and a boot with a soaked piece of paper hidden inside. The words, barely legible, read, "South Ridge. They've moved." No name, no signature, just the mark of a sparrow that had flown one last time into the storm and changed the course of a battle in 24 hours. The war moved on. Armies crossed rivers, cities changed hands, and flags rose and fell like tides. In the chaos that followed, no one thought to ask about the woman who had vanished near Caen. The farmhouse was reduced to rubble, and in its ruins, a handful of villagers built new lives. The war had taken enough from them already. They didn't look back. But history, like the soil, hides everything for a time and then, slowly, gives it back. 20 years later, in the summer of 1964, a group of workers digging foundations for a new road near Caen uncovered the remains of an old cellar. Beneath layers of dirt and stone, they found a rusted radio set, an enamel cup, and a small brass locket with the initials EL engraved on the back. The foreman almost threw it aside, another relic of the war, but one of the men, a young history student from Rouen, took it home. Inside the locket was a photograph, a woman with kind eyes and a calm, tired smile. Behind her, barely visible, was a faded British emblem on a map pinned to the wall. He cleaned the photo, tucked it into his notebook, and began asking questions. Most of the villagers were gone by then, but an old baker remembered her. "Ah, Madame Laurent," he said softly. "The widow. She sold bread to everyone, even the Germans. Always polite, always quiet. Then one day, she just vanished." When the student asked what had happened to her, the baker simply shrugged. The war swallowed many. But the student didn't stop there. He traveled to London, to the archives of the War Office, where thousands of files still sat under dust and silence. He spent days reading faded papers marked classified, until finally, in a folder titled SOE, France, 1944, he found a note written in pencil. Code name Sparrow. Presumed KIA, Consector. Final message received 0445 hours, June 28th. Intelligence confirmed enemy armor relocation. Operation Hammer success, attributed to source Sparrow. The student stared at the words for a long time. Then he opened his notebook and placed the photograph beside the report. Same face, same woman. He had found her. The story spread slowly, like a whisper caught by the wind. Newspapers published short articles. Unknown French woman saved Allied troops. The forgotten spy of Normandy. Veterans wrote letters to the editor, some remembering a rumor, a civilian who had warned them at the last minute. Others swore they had seen a lone farmhouse burning that night. In London, a retired intelligence officer named James Rooke read the article with trembling hands. He had been a young signalman in 1944, the one who received her last transmission. He still remembered the sound of her voice over the static. Calm, determined, then fading into silence. He traveled to France that same month. The village had changed, but the air still carried the smell of rain and soil. When he reached the site, all he found was an open field of wild flowers. But when the wind shifted, he thought he heard a faint echo of a woman's voice, whispering coordinates. Not from memory, but from somewhere deeper, like time itself had recorded her. He took off his hat and bowed his head. "You did it, Sparrow," he said quietly. "We heard you. We finally heard you." Decades passed. The Cold War came and went. Soldiers grew old, and their stories turned into books, movies, and lessons. Yet some stories still refused to be told fully. Not because they were forgotten, but because they were too fragile, too human to fit into the bold language of history. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the war's end, a ceremony was held in Normandy. Veterans stood in rows under a gray sky, medals shining against old uniforms. Among them was James Rooke, now a frail man with silver hair and a cane. When the announcer read the names of those who had fallen, Rook stepped forward. "There's one name missing," he said into the microphone. A woman who had no uniform, no rank, and no grave. Her name was Elise Laurent, codename Sparrow. She saved hundreds of us one night near Cannes. I know, because I heard her voice. I never saw her face, but I remember the sound, clear, certain, like she already knew she wouldn't see another sunrise. The crowd fell silent. For a long moment, only the sound of the wind moved through the fields, the same wind that had carried her last words half a century before. Then, one by one, the veterans raised their hands in salute. Not long after, a small memorial was built near Cannes. It wasn't grand, just a stone marker by the roadside, engraved with simple words. To the unknown agent who warned the free armies. Her voice saved the living, but for those who knew the story, it was more than stone. It was a point in the earth where courage had changed the direction of war. And yet, even that was not the end of Sparrow's story. In 2018, a historian named Claire Rook, granddaughter of James, began researching her grandfather's wartime files for a documentary on Allied intelligence. She had grown up hearing fragments of the story. The mysterious woman, the radio message, the miracle at Cannes. But the official records were still vague, almost intentionally incomplete. One evening, while combing through digitized archives, she found something strange. An intercepted German report, dated the same day as Elise's last message. The report described a French civilian woman shot during security sweep south of Cannes. Radio components found nearby. The name wasn't given, but the coordinates matched exactly. Claire leaned back in her chair, the glow of the screen reflecting in her eyes. After all those years, the silence had finally spoken. She decided to visit the site herself. When she arrived, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and violet. The field was quiet, filled with tall grass and wild flowers. She walked slowly, tracing the outlines of where the old farmhouse had stood. Guided by faded maps and her grandfather's letters, she crouched near a patch of earth marked by weathered stones, the remains of the foundation. Running her fingers across the soil, she whispered, "You never had a grave, so maybe this is where you've been resting all along." A breeze passed through the grass. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang. She smiled softly. "Grandfather was right. We finally heard you." Then she placed a small object in the dirt, the same brass locket that had started it all, now cleaned and polished. Inside was a new photograph, one of Elise and one of her grandfather beside a radio, taken long ago. For a moment, the world was utterly still. Then the wind shifted again, and for the briefest second, Claire thought she heard a voice. Not in her head, but all around her, woven into the air itself. "South Ridge. They've moved." She looked up sharply. The field was empty, but she knew what she'd heard. That night, back in her hotel room, she wrote the final narration for her film. History remembers battles by the maps they change, but not the hearts that stop them from ending worse. In one night, a single voice turned chaos into order, death into survival. She didn't live to see the dawn, but because of her, the dawn came for others. In the archives, they called her Sparrow. In truth, she was the echo that refused to die. When the film premiered the next year, veterans and families wept quietly in the dark. The final scene showed the wildflower field under sunrise, wind moving gently through the grass. No music played, only the faint sound of static. Then a woman's voice, calm and resolute. "South Ridge. They've moved." The screen faded to black. Outside the theater, Claire stood alone, looking at the sky. It was raining lightly. The same kind of soft rain her grandfather had once described when he first heard Sparrow's voice through the static. She closed her eyes and listened. The city noise faded. replaced by the steady patter of rain, the rhythm of breath, and in between it all, the faint hum of something eternal. Memory itself. And in that moment, she understood. A battle might last a day, a war might last years, but courage, once spoken, echoes forever. Months passed after the film's release, but Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something still waited for her back in Normandy. The documentary had been a success, praised by historians, embraced by veterans' families, even nominated for an award. Yet, deep down, she felt that Sparrow's story wasn't truly complete. There was one question still whispering in her mind. Who was Elise before she became Sparrow? She had read every record, every coded dispatch, every survivor's account. But Elise's life before the war was a void. A name on a ration card, a bakery in Cunning, a husband listed as missing, presumed dead. That was all. Until one morning, a small envelope arrived at her flat in London. The return address was from a woman named Odette Lefebvre, 94 years old, living in Avranches, France. The letter was written in an elegant, trembling hand. Dear Mademoiselle Rook, I saw your film. You told her story so beautifully. I knew Elise. We were girls together in Cannes. I think there is something you should see. Claire's hands shook slightly as she folded the letter. 2 days later, she was on a train to Avranches. The village lay nestled among rolling green hills, quiet and timeless. Odette's house was small, whitewashed, with ivy climbing its walls and a wooden gate that creaked when pushed open. Inside, the old woman waited by the fire, wrapped in a shawl, her eyes bright despite her age. I never thought anyone would remember her, Odette said softly as they sat. After the war, everyone was too busy rebuilding. No one wanted to talk about what was lost. She motioned toward a faded trunk beside the hearth. It's all there. She left it with me before she disappeared. Claire hesitated, then opened the trunk carefully. Inside were a few folded dresses, a small mirror, a dried bouquet wrapped in newspaper, and a bundle of letters tied with a ribbon. The paper was yellowed, fragile. The ink faded, but still legible. The first letter was addressed to Henri Laurent, Elise's husband. My dearest, if this reaches you, it means I am gone. But know that I never stopped believing you were alive. When they told me you were lost near Dunkirk, I felt something inside me go silent. But silence can be powerful, Henri. In it, I found purpose. If I can save even one life in this madness, perhaps it will mean ours was not lived in vain. It will mean ours was not lived in vain. Claire's throat tightened as she read. Another letter followed. Unsent. Addressed to no one. Sometimes I dream of the bakery, the smell of bread in the morning, the sound of your laughter. Then I wake to the sound of boots outside. I have learned to smile at them, to serve them bread and wine, to count the minutes until they leave. They think I am harmless. Perhaps that is my greatest weapon. Odette watched her quietly. She wasn't a spy because someone ordered her to be, she said. She became one because she couldn't stand to do nothing while men like her husband were dying. She joined the resistance when the first soldiers came to Cannes. I was too frightened. She wasn't. Claire turned the last letter over. It was dated June 27, 1944, the day before Elise's final transmission. The writing was hurried but steady. If anyone finds this, tell them I am not afraid. The message will reach them. It must. If I fall, then let it be knowing I kept my promise. To love, to fight, and to never let fear be the last thing I feel. At the bottom, barely legible, were 3 words. For Henri. Always. Claire folded the letter gently, tears stinging her eyes. Did she ever talk about him? She asked. Odette nodded slowly. Every day. She believed he would return. But he never did. Do you know what happened to him? The old woman hesitated, then looked toward the fire. That's the part no one ever found out, but I think you might want to speak to the archives in Calais. I remember her once saying Henri's unit retreated there. Maybe you'll find something." Claire thanked her, promising to return the letters once she had them properly preserved. That night she couldn't sleep. Elise's words echoed through her mind like radio static from another time. "If I fall, then let it be knowing I kept my promise." The next week, Claire stood inside the dusty records hall in Calais, flipping through a stack of wartime personnel files. The clerk, a kind man with gray spectacles, brought her a box marked "Dunkirk Evacuations, Lost Personnel." Hours passed, paper after paper, name after name. And then, there it was. Henri Laurent, 3rd Engineer Regiment, evacuated May 28, 1940. Listed as wounded, evacuated to Britain via HMS Worcester. Claire froze. "Evacuated?" she whispered. "Then he survived." She scanned the rest of the report. Transferred to medical facility, Oxfordshire, 1940. Status: recovered. Assigned to civilian reconstruction detail. London, 1941. Civilian alias approved for security. Henry Law. Henry Law. Claire's breath caught. She'd seen that name before. Buried deep in the records of the Special Operations Executive. Field Trainer, Communications Division, SOE. Service period, 1942-1945. Her heart raced. Henri had been alive and working for the same organization that sent Elise into the field. She printed the file and sat in stunned silence. The man Elise had loved, the one she believed she had lost, had been within the same network, maybe even trained the agents who carried her messages. But he never knew she was one of them. Her identity, her code name, would have been sealed under strict secrecy. He died in 1952, according to the final note, of pneumonia. His effects included a single item listed as personal keepsake, unidentified female locket, returned to widow, location unknown. Claire realized then that was the same locket she had found decades later in the ground. It had come full circle. That night, she sat by her hotel window, watching the rain slide down the glass. The city outside blurred into reflections of yellow lights. She opened her laptop and began typing her final notes. They were two souls separated by war, bound by purpose, and reunited by history's quiet persistence. He lived believing she was gone. She died believing he was lost. Yet their choices saved countless lives. Together, though neither ever knew it, as she wrote, she could almost feel Elise's presence. Not as a ghost, but as a voice within the silence. The same quiet strength that had once guided entire armies through darkness. The following spring, Claire returned once more to the field near Caen. This time, she wasn't alone. A small group of historians, local officials, and veterans' families had gathered for the dedication of a new memorial plaque. The inscription read, "In honor of Elise and Henri Laurent. Lovers, patriots, voices of courage." Their words changed the course of a battle, and their silence changed history. Claire stood quietly as the wind moved through the grass. She held one of Elise's letters in her hand, sealed inside a small glass capsule, and placed it beneath the plaque. When the crowd began to leave, she lingered behind. The sky was darkening, streaked with the soft red of sunset. Somewhere far off, thunder murmured, or maybe it was just memory rumbling across the decades. She whispered into the wind, "You found each other again." For a moment, the air seemed to shimmer. The grass bent in a single direction, as if pushed by unseen hands. And though no sound came, Claire felt it. The echo of a transmission that had crossed not just battle lines, but time itself. South Ridge. They've moved. A pause. Then softer, fainter. "Henri, it's done." The wind stilled. Claire smiled through tears. "Yes, Elise," she said softly. It's done. As the first stars appeared, she walked away from the field, leaving the memorial glowing faintly in the fading light. Behind her, the night settled quietly over the land, the same earth that had once hidden a secret, now carrying it into eternity. Somewhere in the distance, a nightingale began to sing, a rare sound in that part of Normandy. And if one listened closely, between the pauses of its song, it almost sounded like a message, steady, patient, and unbroken. The last transmission of Sparrow. A year passed. The Normandy Memorial became a quiet stop for travelers, not grand, not crowded, just a stone by the roadside that people sometimes left flowers beside without knowing exactly why. The locals said that at dusk, when the light slanted across the fields, you could still hear a faint whisper in the wind. They called it the voice of the sparrow. Claire visited whenever she could. Each time the field looked different. Wildflowers in spring, tall gold grass in summer, silver frost in winter. But something about the place always felt alive, like time hadn't fully moved on. Her film continued to touch lives long after its release. Letters poured in, from families of soldiers who'd fought near Caen, from students writing essays, from descendants of agents who'd served in the Special Operations Executive. One message came from a man in Canada who wrote, "My grandfather said he survived Caen because someone warned them to move at 4 a.m. He never knew who. Now he does. Thank you." But the message that stayed with her most came from a woman in Dorset. "My mother worked at Bletchley Park, decoding field transmissions. She once told me about a signal that came through one night in June 1944. Clear as a bell despite the storm. The operator said, 'We have confirmation from Sparrow.' My mother never forgot that name. She said it sounded like hope." Claire read the letter 3 times. It confirmed what she had always believed. Elise's voice hadn't just changed a battle. It had reached across nations, carried through the fragile veins of radio waves, and given hope to people who would never even know her face. Later that summer, she returned to London for a commemorative exhibition at the Imperial War Museum. Her documentary had inspired a new section dedicated to unsung agents, those whose names never appeared in textbooks, but whose actions had shaped history nonetheless. As she walked through the exhibit, she noticed a small display at the end of the hall, a glass case containing a restored SOE radio transmitter, a replica of Elise's locket, and a short inscription on brass, codename Sparrow. Civilian agent, Normandy, 1944. Final transmission received June 28th, Aeroford for 5 hours. Message accuracy confirmed. Allied forces repositioned successfully, saving over 700 lives. Beneath it, in smaller text, a quote from Elise's last letter. "If I fall, then let it be knowing I kept my promise. To love, to fight, and to never let fear be the last thing I feel." Visitors passed by quietly, reading, reflecting. A few wiped their eyes. Claire stood there for a long time, her reflection merging with the photograph in the glass. Elise's face beside her own. 2 women, separated by 8 decades, connected by a single thread of defiance. That evening, after the exhibition, Claire took a walk through central London. The city was alive with lights, laughter, music, so different from the London Elise and Henri had known during the Blitz. She crossed Westminster Bridge, watching the river flow black and silver beneath the lamps. She imagined Elise walking these same streets in 1943, head down, blending into the crowds, clutching the same radio codes that would one day change the tide of war. How strange, she thought, that courage could look so ordinary. Her phone buzzed, a message from Odette's niece. The old woman had passed away peacefully 2 nights before. In her final days, she had asked that Claire receive one last envelope from her collection. When Claire opened it later that night, she found a single sheet of paper. Handwritten, faded, but clear enough to read. June 27, 1944. Elise asked me to post this if she didn't return, but the post was destroyed that week, and I couldn't bear to lose it. Perhaps now it will reach the one who needs to hear it. The note inside was written in Elise's familiar hand, softer this time, as if she had written it in the quiet between fear and acceptance. To whoever finds this, I don't know your name. I don't know if you'll ever understand why we did what we did, but I hope you live in a world that no longer needs to hide truth behind code. Tell them we were not heroes. We were people who loved our families, our country, the idea of tomorrow. We just refused to let tomorrow die. If love still exists in your time, then everything we lost was worth it. E.L. L. Claire set the letter down and covered her mouth with trembling fingers. For a long time she said nothing. Then she whispered, "It reached me, Elise. It reached me." Months later, she stood once more in the Normandy field, this time with a small team filming a new project, a follow-up called Echoes of Sparrow. The crew moved quietly, respectful of the space. Claire narrated softly while the camera captured the wildflowers swaying in the summer wind. In war, voices are often lost, but sometimes they survive, carried by air, by memory, by love that refuses to fade. Sparrow's voice traveled farther than any bullet or bomb. It reached us across time, across silence. The camera zoomed out, the field filling the frame like a sea of gold. The sound of wind blended with faint static, recreated from Elise's original Morse recordings. Perhaps that's the real victory. Not the battles we win, but the stories that remain, and the courage that still whispers, even when the war is long over. As the crew packed up, Claire lingered one last time by the memorial. The sun dipped low, spilling amber light across the inscription. She knelt and placed a single white rose at its base. When she stood, something caught her eye. A glint of metal half buried in the dirt near the edge of the field. She crouched and brushed the soil aside. It was an old signet ring, tarnished but intact, engraved with two letters entwined together, H and E. Her breath caught. It must have been his. Henri's. She turned it in her hand, the setting sun flashing across its surface. Then, with a trembling smile, she slipped it onto a chain and placed it around her neck. "Together again," she murmured. The breeze stirred gently, warm and soft, rustling through the grass like footsteps moving away into the distance. That night, back at her hotel, Claire dreamed, she stood in the same field, but it was no longer empty. The farmhouse stood whole again, windows glowing with candlelight. The air smelled of bread and rain. A woman stood by the doorway, hair tied back, apron dusted with flour. A man in uniform approached from the lane, his face tired but smiling. "Elise," he said. "Henri," she whispered. They met in silence, the kind that exists beyond time. The candles flickered once, and then the house began to fade, dissolving into the morning mist. When Claire awoke, tears had streaked her face, but she was smiling. She rose early, packed her bags, and took one last look at the field from her window. The dawn was soft, quiet, and filled with the hum of life beginning again. Birds, wind, and the distant ringing of church bells. In that sound, faint but real, she heard it. Elise's voice, calm and steady, just as her grandfather had once heard it through the static. Message received, and for the first time in decades, maybe in generations, the world was finally listening. The film Echoes of Sparrow premiered the following spring. It opened with no music, only the sound of a radio tuning through static, then finding a single clear voice saying, "South Ridge, they've moved." The final frame showed the Normandy field under sunrise. At the bottom of the screen, simple white text faded in, dedicated to those whose courage was never written down, but never forgotten. The screen faded to black. The theater was silent. Then came applause. Soft at first, then thunderous. For Claire, it wasn't the sound of success. It was the sound of memory finally finding peace. She looked up, imagining somewhere, beyond the noise, beyond the years, a woman and a man standing together on a quiet ridge, watching the sun rise over a world they had helped save. And maybe, just maybe, a sparrow flew overhead, carrying their story into the endless morning. 50 years later, the world had changed again. The old scars of the 20th century had faded into museums and memorials, while new generations walked through the streets of peace that others had once died to protect. But every now and then, someone still found themselves drawn to the lonely roadside near Caen, where a single stone marker stood beneath an oak tree. One autumn afternoon, a young boy named Julian stopped there with his school group. He was 10 years old, more interested in the shape of clouds than in history lessons, but something about the quiet field caught his attention. The teacher explained that it was a memorial to a woman who had helped the Allies win a battle long ago, a woman named Elise Laurent. Julian squinted at the name, carved deep into the stone. "Was she a soldier?" he asked. The teacher smiled. "No, she was a baker, I think. But she had courage. Sometimes courage doesn't wear a uniform." The boy nodded, not fully understanding, but feeling something stir anyway. A strange, soft pride, as if the ground itself was whispering secrets. He bent down and noticed a small plaque newly added beside the stone. It read, "In memory of all who fought with silence and bravery, and those who passed their stories forward." There was a list of names beneath, including one he didn't recognize. Claire Rook, historian, 1985-2048. Julian's teacher said she was the woman who had rediscovered Elise's story decades ago, the one who made the film everyone studied in history class. She died peacefully in her sleep a few years earlier, her ashes scattered in this very field. Her final wish. The boy crouched down and touched the plaque. It was warm from the sun. In the distance, a sparrow darted from one branch to another, its wings catching the light. He smiled. "She came back," he whispered. Decades earlier, before her passing, Claire had returned to Normandy one last time. She had grown old gracefully, hair silver, steps slower, but her eyes still bright with the fire that had driven her to uncover Sparrow's truth. She came not as a filmmaker or historian, but simply as herself. She brought no cameras, no notebooks, just a single white rose and a small leather-bound journal. In that journal, she wrote her final entry. "I used to believe that history was about what we remember, but I think now it's about what refuses to be forgotten." Sparrow's voice didn't survive because it was recorded. It survived because it was felt. It lived in the people who owed their lives to her, even if they never knew her name. It lived in me, in the air I breathed, in the stories I told. And maybe, if I've done my part, it will live on in someone else too. She closed the book and laid it at the base of the memorial. Then she looked up at the horizon, where the sun broke through the clouds in soft, golden ribbons. "I'll be going soon," she said quietly. "But you'll still be here, won't you?" The wind answered in a long, gentle sigh, moving through the tall grass, bending the wildflowers without breaking them. She smiled, recognizing that sound, the same steady whisper that had followed her all her life. "Message received," she whispered. Then she turned and walked away, her figure slowly blending with the light until the field was empty again. After her death, her nephew, a filmmaker like her, took up her work. He found the old reels, the journals, the transcripts of interviews she'd done with veterans and survivors. He spent months restoring them, determined to preserve not just the facts, but the feeling. Just the facts, but the feeling. When the new documentary premiered, titled Sparrow's Legacy, it opened not with bombs or gunfire, but with the sound of wind moving through grass. Then a voice, Claire's, recorded years ago, began to speak. When we tell stories of war, we often talk about victory and defeat. But sometimes, the most important story is of the voice that kept speaking when no one was listening. Then came the static, soft and rhythmic, like a heartbeat through the years. "They've moved," Elise's voice said faintly, clear even after a century. The screen faded to black. The credits rolled, and when the lights came up, no one moved for a moment. The documentary went on to win awards, but more importantly, it reignited something rare: empathy, curiosity, connection. Schools began to include Sparrow's story in their history lessons, not as a footnote, but as a reminder that courage has many faces. In 2064, 120 years after Elise's final transmission, a time capsule was opened in London. It had been buried beneath the old SOE headquarters, sealed during the war with instructions to open it when peace has lasted longer than conflict. Inside were various relics, medals, field maps, a faded British flag. But among them, wrapped in oilcloth, was something unexpected: a small brass locket, engraved EL inside, 2 photographs, one of Elise and Henri, taken before the war, he in his engineer's jacket, she in her bakery apron, both smiling. The other was newer, printed decades later, Claire standing in the same field, holding the same locket. Someone in the crowd whispered, "It found its way back." A historian nearby nodded. It always does. Some stories are built to return home. The locket was placed in the National War Museum's permanent collection under the title "The Voice That Saved the Dawn." Outside, the city hummed with life. Electric trams slid along quiet streets. Children played in parks that had once been bomb craters. The air was cleaner, the noise softer, the future somehow kinder. And on a park bench across from the museum sat an old man, Julian, now gray-haired, his hands resting on a walking stick. He watched as people entered and exited the museum, smiling faintly. Around his neck hung a small silver pendant in the shape of a sparrow. His granddaughter sat beside him, scrolling through a tablet showing a holographic reenactment of the Battle of Caen. "Grand-père," she said, "is it true? That one person's message saved all those soldiers?" He nodded slowly. "Yes, one person, one message, one heartbeat at the right time." "Do you think she knew what it meant?" the girl asked. He thought for a long moment before answering. Maybe she didn't need to. Maybe she just trusted that someone would hear her. "That's enough." The girl leaned against his shoulder, thoughtful. "I want to be brave like that someday." Julian smiled. "Then you already are." The breeze shifted. Across the street, a sparrow landed on the museum steps, chirped twice, and flew off into the sunlight. As dusk fell over London, the museum lights reflected off the locket's glass, sending a beam of gold across the display room. For a moment, it illuminated the words etched beneath it, barely visible except at the right angle. She spoke once, and the world changed. Visitors passed by, unaware of the faint hum that filled the room, a resonance too low for most to notice, the soft murmur of a frequency recorded long ago. Those who did hear it described it later as the sound of calm wind, or perhaps a heartbeat, or maybe, if they really listened, a voice whispering through time. South Ridge. They've moved, and beneath it, even softer, almost lost in the air. Message received. The light faded, the hum quieted, and, in the stillness that followed, the story of Sparrow, Elise Laurent, the woman who changed one battle in 24 hours, lived on, not just in books or films, but in every quiet act of courage that rose from fear and chose to move forward anyway. Because sometimes history doesn't end. It simply passes the message along. The night was quiet again, the kind of silence that only comes after chaos. Smoke drifted across the ruined fields of Normandy, carrying with it the faint smell of cordite and rain. The guns had fallen silent. The sky, once red with fire, now shimmered with faint starlight. In the distance, the echoes of retreating engines marked the collapse of a German counterattack. The Allies had held the line. The ridge, the one Sparrow had warned them about, was secure. The cost had been terrible, but the victory decisive. Commanders across the front whispered that a single intercepted transmission had changed everything. No one knew who had sent it. No one knew where it came from. In a small farmhouse near Caen, Henri sat alone beside a broken window, his face bruised and bloodied, a bandage wrapped around his shoulder. The radio that Elise had used lay in front of him, silent now, its wires frayed, its tubes dark. He had found it buried under rubble, still warm when he'd arrived. He had dug with his bare hands, shouting her name again and again. He had found her under a collapsed beam, her body broken, but her face calm, as if she had simply fallen asleep while waiting for dawn. In her hand, clutched tightly against her chest, was the locket, the same one he had given her before the war. Inside it, folded carefully, was a slip of paper on which she had written 2 words. Message sent. Henri's breath trembled as he held her hand one last time. "You did it, Elise," he whispered. "They heard you." Outside, the first Allied soldiers were moving through the fields, collecting wounded and clearing debris. One young radio operator passed the farmhouse and noticed Henri sitting there. "Sir," he said softly, "Headquarters wants to know if this is where the message came from." Henri looked up slowly. "Yes," he said, voice barely audible. "This is where it came from." The soldier saluted, then hesitated. "What should I tell them her name was?" Henri looked down at the woman who had given everything, at the still, peaceful expression on her face. Then he smiled through the tears. "Tell them," he said. "It was Sparrow." Years passed. The war ended. Europe rebuilt itself brick by brick, breath by breath. People married. Children were born, and the world learned to live again. But for Henri, time never fully healed the silence she left behind. He returned to his old home in Paris, repaired radios for a living, and every evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops, he would tune one of the old transmitters to the same frequency Elise had used. Most nights, there was nothing but static. But sometimes, just sometimes, he would hear the faintest echo of her voice. A tone, a pause, a single syllable lost in the noise. He never told anyone about it. He just smiled and whispered into the microphone, "Message received." Decades later, in a quiet museum in London, a group of visitors gathered around a glass case. Inside it lay a small, battered radio, its metal frame scarred by shrapnel, its dials frozen mid-turn. A plaque read, "The Sparrow Transmitter, used by unknown operatives to relay critical intelligence that altered the outcome of the Battle of Caen, June 1944. No one knew her name. No photo existed. Her story had faded into whispers and speculation, a ghost in the static of history. But one visitor lingered longer than the rest. A woman in her 30s, a historian named Claire Rook, stood there with her hand pressed gently to the glass. Her grandfather had once told her stories about a woman who had saved his life during the war. A voice over the radio that had guided his unit away from an ambush. He had never known who she was. But every year, on the anniversary of the battle, he had whispered the same words under his breath before he slept. "Thank you, Sparrow." Claire smiled faintly, her reflection merging with the faint outline of the radio. She took a small notebook from her bag and wrote a single sentence. "Sometimes the greatest battles are won by voices that history cannot name." She closed the notebook and left the museum, the echo of her footsteps fading down the marble corridor. Behind her, the faint hum of the old transmitter seemed to stir for just a moment. A brief, rhythmic pulse, soft as a heartbeat. It might have been the sound of power fluctuations, or maybe, just maybe, it was something else. A whisper through time. South Ridge. They've moved. And then, silence again. Outside, London glowed under a soft evening rain. The war was long over, but the world it had shaped still lived. In every act of courage, every quiet decision, every unseen moment where someone chose to risk everything for others. And somewhere, in the hush between the raindrops and the hum of passing cars, the spirit of Sparrow still moved, invisible, unrecorded, but never forgotten. Because some heroes don't live in history books or victory parades, some live forever in the space between fear and hope, in the single second it takes to press send and change the world, and change the world.